Elias Thorne lived a life bound by the past, yet disconnected from the present. At 32, his existence was a monotonous loop of archival dust, flickering fluorescent bulbs, and the echoing silence of his small, cluttered apartment. He was a brilliant historian specializing in the truly forgotten, not Roman emperors or world wars, but the scraps of myth and folklore dismissed by academia. The Ethel, the shadowbound, cultures that supposedly vanished before recorded history began. Tonight, the quiet was particularly heavy. Rain lashed against the single window of his apartment, the sound a dull percussion against the soundtrack of his profound loneliness. He sat hunched over a desk littered with ancient, brittle photocopies, the centerpiece a single, faded image of a stone altar etched with symbols that pulsed with a strange, dark geometry. The accompanying text, translated from a nearly dead language, described a ritualistic marriage rite, not of love but of claim. A desperate plea for a soul bond that transcended death. Elias ran a hand through his perpetually messy dark hair. He was tired of studying life, he wanted to live it. A life worth living, he muttered to the empty room, his voice raspy with disuse. A connection that actually claims me. An eternity that means something. Is that too much to ask, ghosts? He glanced down at the photocopied ritual instructions. A childish impulse, fueled by a dangerous mix of red wine and self-pity, took hold. He found a half-burned white pillar candle in a drawer, a relic from a power outage, and set it on the altar of his desk. He reached for his utility knife to open a tightly sealed document tube. A slip, mundane and sharp, sliced his thumb. A bead of crimson welled up, bright against the paper. Elias stared at the drop of blood. The ritual text mentioned an offering, a willing sacrifice of self. He knew it was ridiculous, superstitious nonsense. He knew he was drunk. But he was also desperate. He allowed the drop to fall directly onto the central symbol of the ancient ritual sketch. It spread, momentarily darkening the faded ink before being absorbed, leaving a dark, wet stain. There, Elias whispered, extinguishing the candle with a puff of air, plunging the immediate area into shadow. A life worth living. I wish for it. I claim it. He laughed, a short, bitter sound, and headed for the shower, dismissing the whole pathetic display. It was just a tired man wishing on a paper cut. Nothing more. But the moment the bathroom door clicked shut, the shadows in his apartment deepened. Not the gentle graying of evening, but a profound, absolute void that swallowed all light. The temperature plummeted instantly, and where the drop of blood had stained the paper, a faint, crystalline whisper echoed, cold as grave dirt. Claim accepted. The subtle changes began immediately. Elias couldn't shake the cold. Not just a physical chill, but a deep, internal one that seemed to settle in his bones. The shadows in his apartment seemed to possess a new, unnerving density, lurking in the corners with almost predatory patience. His cat, a grumpy ginger named Hobbs, spent hours staring fixedly at the wall where the deepest shadows pooled, his back arched and his tail twitching in silent alarm. Then came the auditory hallucinations. Faint, crystalline whispers in the absolute stillness of his apartment. A language he knew from his research, one spoken only by the ancient Ethel. He told himself it was stress, lack of sleep, or the lingering effects of the wine. The whispers intensified the following Friday. Elias was finally asleep, exhausted by the week, when the pressure in the room woke him. It wasn't sound, it was an absence of sound, an unnatural stillness that felt like the atmosphere had been replaced by dense, glacial water. He opened his eyes. A figure was standing at the foot of his bed. Elias couldn't move. Terror, pure, primal, absolute, locked his muscles. His breath hitched in his throat. She was breathtakingly beautiful, an impossible vision woven from myth and shadow. Her form was statuesque, clad in a long gown that seemed to absorb and distort the faint street light filtering through the blinds. Her skin was the color of fresh snow, impossibly luminous, and her lips were a deep, mesmerizing crimson. Her eyes were the worst. They were pools of liquid obsidian, ancient and boundless, focusing on him with an intensity that stripped away his identity. They were the eyes of a creature that had seen worlds rise and fall, and now saw him as nothing more than an interesting, perhaps necessary, possession. This was no hallucination. This was real. The Empress of Shadows. Wire. She began to move, silent as starlight, gliding around the bed toward him. Elias finally found his voice, a strangled, pitiful sound. What are you? She stopped, leaning over him. Her scent, earth, ancient wine, and ozone, filled his senses. You called for me, Elias Thorne? Her voice resonated, silk over steel, a sound that seemed to originate not in her throat, but from the deep, forgotten crypts of time. You performed the blood oath of the heart-bound kin. A reckless, beautiful thing for a mortal to do. Her long, pale fingers tipped with dark, perfect nails reached out. Elias flinched, expecting a strike, a violent claim. Instead, the cold hand settled gently on his cheek. It wasn't just cold, it was ancient cold, the cold of deep space, yet beneath it was a strange, undeniable pulse of power. "I am Lyra, Empress of the Umbra Ethel," she declared, her eyes narrowing with a frightening possessiveness. "And you wished for a claim. You wished for an eternity. The pact is unbreakable, human. You are mine." She lowered her face toward his. Horror and romantic element, the terrifying proximity, the inevitable fate. "You are now my consort." Elias's mind scrambled, grasping for any shred of sanity. No, I was drunk. It was a joke. I'm calling the police. Get out." He thrashed, trying to roll away, but her grip on his cheek was firm, though not painful. It was absolute. She wasn't holding him, she was anchoring him. A faint, mocking smile touched Lyra's crimson lips. "Police? To whom would you report? A dream? A shadow? I assure you, Elias, my darling, the authorities of this fragile, fleeting little world are not equipped to handle me." To demonstrate, she didn't use force. She simply manipulated the environment. The shadows in the room suddenly condensed, swirling like black water. They didn't just darken, they took on physical presence, rippling across the walls, momentarily wrapping around his arms and legs like thick, cold cords. He was pinned, terrified, unable to move a muscle. Then just as quickly the shadows receded, melting back into the corners. The terror, however, remained. "You invoked an ancient pact," she explained, her voice now softer, almost pedagogical. "It binds the highest of my line to a unique lineage of human catalyst. Your soul, Elias Thorne, resonates with the power we require to survive. Your wish was answered not by chance but by fate. You are not a prisoner, you are claimed." She removed her hand, but the imprint of her touch lingered, a brand of ice and fire. She stood up, her regal posture commanding all attention. "Your life of archival dust and meaningless solitude is over. Your connection to this place is severed. Now we leave." Elias struggled to sit up, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Leave? Where? I have a job, a life." Lyra laughed, a delicate, chilling sound. "You had a job. Your life was a library of dead ends. Now you have me. And I will give you an eternity filled with purpose, power, and history you never dreamed of." She reached down, her movements fluid and decisive, and gently pulled him to his feet. Her strength was terrifying, absolute. He was a doll in her grip. She moved toward the window, her back to him. Then she turned, her eyes holding his in an unblinking, ancient stare. "Do not mistake my patience for weakness, Elias. You belong to the Umbra Ethel now. You belong to me. There is no running. There is only acceptance." She raised her hand. A swirling vortex of pure, inky shadow materialized just behind her, tearing a hole in the fabric of the apartment wall. A portal. "Welcome to your new life, my consort," she said. And then she drew him into the darkness. The transit through the portal was less like walking and more like falling through a sheet of frozen, pressurized water. Elias gasped, the sensation robbing him of orientation and breath. When his feet finally hit solid ground, he stumbled, catching himself against a cold, marble pillar. He was no longer in his small, dusty apartment. He was in a hall of oppressive grandeur. The air was thick with the scent of old stone, expensive oils, and a faint, metallic tang. Towering vaulted ceilings, supported by black obsidian pillars, rose into a gloom that even powerful chandeliers could barely pierce. Stained glass windows, depicting scenes of ancient, shadowed victories, threw fragmented, dark light across the polished, jet-black floor. This wasn't a house, it was a Gothic cathedral of power, a fortress that felt as old as the mountains outside. Lyra, utterly unruffled, stood beside him. She looked at the scene with a cold familiarity. "Welcome, Elias. This is Ethelhold. My seat of power." Elias could only stare. This is impossible. This isn't on any map. It's too big, too old." "Everything you knew was merely a curtain," Lyra said dismissively. "We are the reality behind the myths you studied." A figure emerged from the deep shadows at the far end of the hall. Tall, gaunt, and impeccably dressed in a black ancient livery, the man moved with the silent efficiency of a long-practiced servant. This was Silas, Lyra's ancient advisor, whose pale eyes held a cold, unwavering suspicion as they swept over Elias. "Empress, Silas's voice was dry, like rustling parchment. He bowed, a gesture of deep, chilling reverence. The kin has been delivered. Is this truly the one foretold? He is the one who performed the oath, Lyra stated, her voice brooking no argument. She placed a possessive hand on the small of Elias's back, a gesture that was both a claim and a subtle warning to Silas. He is the heartbound. See to it that the consort's chambers are prepared and secured. I want him settled, warded, and fed. He is fragile. Silas gave Elias a look that clearly stated fragile was one thing, but unnecessary complication was another entirely. As you command, Empress. Come, human. The Empress has much to attend to. Elias dug his heels in. Wait. Hold on. I won't just follow orders. You stole me. You declared I'm your consort? What does that even mean? Am I your hostage? A pet? I deserve answers. Lyra turned back, her obsidian eyes softening infinitesimally, a subtle, manipulative gesture of patience. You will have your answers, Elias. But first you must survive. And in this world that requires my protection. Think of this as the first rule of our eternity. My word is your law. She dismissed him with a nod to Silas, who immediately took Elias by the arm. His grip surprisingly strong, cold, and entirely unwelcome. Elias was led away, through labyrinths of shadowed halls filled with impossible artifacts and ancient secrets, towards his gilded cage. Elias's new chambers were lavish, luxurious, and terrifyingly secure. The room was immense, with dark velvet hangings, a massive four-poster bed, and a private bath carved from what looked like a single block of dark granite. A huge, leaded window looked out onto a dense, mist-shrouded forest that seemed to stretch to the ends of the world. The doors were solid oak reinforced with gleaming, unfamiliar metal. Silas presented him with a silver platter holding a goblet of dark liquid, unquestionably blood, warmed and rich, and a small plate of cured meat and artisan bread. A concession to your mortality, Silas said, his expression devoid of warmth. The Empress desires your health, not your demise. She will require your cooperation. Cooperation in what? Elias demanded, pushing the plate away. The ritual was just a joke. It can't be real. Silas leaned in, his ancient face unsettlingly close. Horror element, the sheer, cold condescension of the ancient servant. Everything the Empress does is real, human. You, a scholar, should understand the power of belief. The blood oath is the highest binding ritual. It wasn't about love, it was about need. The Umbra Ethel is at war and the time for delicacy is over. She needs your lineage, your unique ability to see the connections others have forgotten. What war? Silas gave a tight, thin smile. The one that has been fought since your son was born. We, the Ethel, the shadows, are the necessary balance. We contain the chaos of the ignis mortis, the fire of death. They are the destructive element, the madmen who wish to burn both your fragile world and ours to cinder. And they seek to claim the heart-bound Kinyu, to fuel their ultimate weapon. Elias felt the blood drain from his face, regardless of the goblet of blood sitting beside him. He wasn't just claimed, he was a strategic asset in a war fought by monsters. You are safer here, under the Empress's absolute, if terrifying protection, Silas concluded, his tone chillingly sincere. But do not mistake your position. You are protected, not free. Any attempt to flee, and the Empress will not be merciful. She may desire your soul, but she will not tolerate your disobedience. With a silent bow, Silas left, locking the door with a heavy, final thunk. Elias was alone in his beautiful prison, the terrible reality of his new life finally sinking in. He walked to the window, pressing his forehead against the cold glass, staring at the endless, dark forest. I wished for a life worth living. I wished for an eternity. I got a gilded cage and a queen who needs me for a war I can't comprehend. The next 2 days were a blur of absolute terror, curiosity, and silence. Elias refused the blood, subsisting on the meager, human provisions Silas reluctantly provided. He explored his chambers, finding no escape. He buried himself in his historian's mind, looking for patterns, for logic, for any loophole in his nightmare. On the third night Lyra came. Not through the door, but simply emerging from the deepest shadow in the corner of his room, silent as a thought. She wasn't wearing her formal regalia. She wore a simple, dark silk dressing gown. Her hair, usually perfectly coiled, was unbound, falling down her back like a cascade of black ink. She looked less like an empress and more like an unimaginably old, burdened woman. Elias was sitting at a small writing desk, sketching the symbols he remembered from the portal, trying to deconstruct them. You haven't touched the blood, she noted, her voice flat, tired. It's repulsive, Elias answered honestly, bracing for anger. I'm not a vampire. Lyra moved to stand behind him, looking down at his sketches. Yet you are bound to one. A small price for the eternity you demanded. I demanded connection, not servitude. What about you? Are you incapable of connection? Or is your only connection the need for power? Elias challenged, the fear momentarily replaced by indignation. Lyra went silent. She walked to the window, staring out at the mist. For the first time, Elias saw something break through her regal composure. A profound, ancient grief. I have worn this crown for 2,000 years, Elias, she whispered, her voice cracking with the weight of ages. Emotional element. Lyra's deep weariness. I have buried my family, my friends, and 3 consorts who died protecting the Ethel. I have watched your world burn and rebuild countless times. The Umbra Ethel is not about power, it is about a sacred, terrible duty to hold the line against chaos. She turned, her eyes glittering with unshed tears that looked like diamonds. I am absolutely capable of connection, Elias. But connection for me always ends in loss. When you made your wish, you invoked a pact that promises a bond stronger than death. It promises me the stability I need to finally win this war and rest. She walked toward him, her movements now soft, vulnerable, human-like. She didn't touch him, but she was close enough that he could feel the cold radiating from her skin. Show me your neck, she commanded, not in a voice of dominance but one of deep need. Elias, mesmerized by her vulnerability, slowly tilted his head, exposing his throat. Lyra leaned in. He could feel her cold breath, smell the ancient earth and ozone. His heart pounded. This was it. The horror. The claim. But she didn't bite. She didn't pierce his skin. Instead, she simply pressed her lips, cold, perfect, soft, to the pulse point on his neck just above the collarbone. It was a kiss, a profound, chilling affirmation of her absolute claim, her need, and her promise. You are the closest thing to hope I have had in a millennium, Elias Thorne, she whispered against his skin. Do not disappoint me. She pulled back, her eyes holding his. The regal mask had returned, but the vulnerability lingered in the shadow behind her eyes. Then, with a swirl of shadow, she vanished, leaving the scent of ancient earth and the terrifying coldness of her kiss imprinted on his skin. Elias was left alone, reeling from the realization. He was falling in love with his captor, the Empress of Shadows. Lyra began Elias's education the following night. She didn't return to his chambers. Instead, Silas escorted him through the depths of Ethelhold to a vast, circular chamber that served as a strategic command center. It was lined with ancient maps that shifted and glowed with arcane energy, tracking movements Elias couldn't comprehend. The war you learned about in dusty books is real, Elias, Lyra said, standing before a shifting projection that showed the globe overlaid with swirling patterns of black and violent red. It is fought on a plane just adjacent to yours. Humanity is the largest prize but also the largest shield. She explained the history of the Umbra Ethel. They were not demons or devils but beings who evolved alongside humanity, feeding on life force and blood, yes, but fundamentally serving as a containment unit. A stable, ancient power meant to police the far greater, far more destructive forces. Our enemy is the Ignis Mortis, Lyra stated, gesturing toward the red patterns on the map, which seemed to erupt in areas of high human chaos. Wars, natural disasters, mass hysteria. They are chaos given form. They seek not to rule but to annihilate. To unleash raw, primordial energy back onto the world. She focused on Elias. Your ancestors, the heart-bound kin, were the original link between the Umbra and humanity. Your lineage possessed a rare spiritual resonance. A soul signature that, when claimed by an Ethel, creates a profound bond. This bond not only strengthens the claiming Ethel, but also makes them resistant to the chaotic corruption of the Ignis Mortis. Elias, the cynical historian, was absorbing the impossible truth. So, I'm a magical battery. A walking prophylactic against evil. Lyra stepped closer, her expression intense. You are the key to my stability, yes. And because of that, you are the prime target of the Ignis Mortis. If they can capture you and corrupt that resonance, they can shatter the stability of my entire race. They can win. Lyra's gaze softened slightly. Romantic element, the shared, terrifying destiny. I claimed you because I need you, Elias. But the bond is not one-sided. You wished for meaning. You wished for eternity. Your life now has purpose. The fate of 2 worlds rests on your existence. And you have a partner who will never abandon you. She showed him the protective wards woven into the castle's very stone, explained the layers of defense, and then handed him a heavy leather-bound volume, a book detailing the history of the Ignis Mortis and their methods. You are a historian, Elias. Use the tools of your past to survive your future. Study their patterns. Find their weaknesses. Elias, driven by the realization that his survival was now directly linked to Lyra's victory, dove into his research. The ancient texts were written in languages he knew, but now they contained terrifying, concrete truths. His historical mind finally had its life worth living, the ultimate research project. His days settled into a routine of study, punctuated by Lyra's visits and training sessions led by one of her silent, formidable guards. The training was less about fighting and more about situational awareness, teaching him to sense the shift in the air when Ethel magic was used, to spot the visual distortion of minor illusions, and to move silently in the dark. Horror element. During one training session, Elias witnessed a display of Ethel power. Lyra, demonstrating her manipulation of shadow, pulled a small bird that had strayed into the manor's boundary from the air. She didn't crush it, she simply drained its color, its movement and its vitality in an instant, leaving behind a perfectly preserved, gray husk. "This is what happens when the bond is broken, Elias," she said, her voice chilling. "The Umbra Ethel become untethered. This is the fate we prevent." The romantic tension between Elias and Lyra grew, complicated by the constant threat and the absolute power imbalance. Their meetings moved beyond strategy. She would find him in the library, sometimes just watching him study. They discussed philosophy, ancient poetry, and the fleeting nature of human memory, the things that made Elias Elias. One evening, Lyra found him looking at a scroll depicting the previous heartbound kin, a warrior who died centuries ago. "Did you love them?" Elias asked, the question fraught with insecurity and jealousy. Lyra took the scroll, her fingers brushing his. "I needed them. And in time, perhaps I loved what they represented. But the connection was always incomplete. You're different. You summon me with intent, not obligation. You are the only one who has chosen this eternity, even unknowingly." She touched his jaw, her eyes searching his. "Intimacy and trust. Do you still wish to be free of my claim, Elias?" He hesitated, the terror still a low thrum beneath his skin, but overshadowed by a burning, terrifying loyalty. "I wish I hadn't been tricked into it. But no. I think I finally found what I was looking for. I am claimed. And I want to see this war won." Lyra didn't say, "I love you." She instead drew him into a cold, powerful embrace, burying her face in his neck. It was a gesture of overwhelming relief and need. "Then we will win, consort. Together." As Elias grew more comfortable in his role, he also grew more observant. The court of the Umbra Ethel was small, composed mostly of ancient nobles and dedicated warriors, all intensely loyal to Lyra. But there was one exception, Silas. Silas was always present, always efficient, and always observing Elias with that same cold disapproval. One day, Elias was in the map room, cross-referencing a location mentioned in the Ignis Mortis text Lyra had given him with an ancient Ethel map. He realized the coordinates of a known Ignis Mortis stronghold matched the location of an obscure hidden Umbra Ethel armory, a location that only a few highly trusted Inner Circle members would know. "Silas," Elias called out, noting the advisor was organizing a set of ancient bronze keys nearby. "This location, the Chasm of the Dying Sun, it's one of ours, isn't it? A hidden fortress." Silas paused, his back to Elias. "That is classified information, human. Focus on the enemy's movements, not our defenses." "But if it's the target and they know the location, then they have a mole," Elias pressed, his historian's mind running the pattern recognition. "Who else knew that location besides you and the Empress?" Silas turned, his face placid, but his eyes flashed with something akin to rage. "First sign of dissent. The arrogance of a newly claimed mortal is astonishing. Do not presume to question the loyalty of the Empress's most devoted servants, Elias. Your only duty is to obey her. And your only worth is your blood oath." Silas moved closer, a chilling calmness in his voice. "Be careful, consort. Lyra needs your strength, but she also needs absolute control. If she senses that you are becoming a risk, or too curious about the wrong things, even your unique blood won't save you. The Empress always has a purpose. Never forget that." The warning wasn't a threat of betrayal, it was a subtle, venomous warning about Lyra. It planted a seed of doubt. Was Lyra keeping him safe, or was she just keeping him controlled until his blood could be used for the ultimate weapon? Elias felt a chill deeper than the vampire cold, realizing he was caught not just in a war of light and shadow, but in a lethal game of ancient political chess. Elias's suspicion about the chasm of the dying sun quickly became grim reality. 2 nights later an alarm, a low, discordant hum that vibrated through Ethelhold's stone, woke him. Lyra burst into his room, fully clad in a suit of dark, flexible armor that seemed to drink the light. Her eyes were burning gold with urgency. "The Ignis Mortis," she stated, her voice sharp and devoid of emotion. "They are attempting a surgical strike. They bypassed the outer wards almost entirely. Someone within led them through the hidden paths." She grabbed his wrist, her grip like iron. "Stay close. This house is a fortress, but the corridors will become a battlefield. They are here for one thing, you." Lyra moved with terrifying speed, pulling Elias behind her, down into the deeper, secure catacombs. As they moved, the silence of the ancient manor was broken by the sickening sounds of combat, shouts, the crackle of fire magic, and the heavy thud of bodies hitting stone. They were near the central defense chamber when they were cut off. 4 figures, draped in tattered, scorched leather and wielding blades that shimmered with sickly orange light, emerged from a side corridor blocking their path. These were the Ignis Mortis agents, rogue, chaotic vampires, their faces contorted with mad fury and their eyes glowing with unnatural inner heat. "The heart-bound kin," one snarled, his voice a dry rasp of scorched earth. "The flame consumes all shadow." Lyra shoved Elias behind a massive ornamental sarcophagus and stepped forward. "You will not touch him." The battle was brief and brutal. Lyra was a whirlwind of shadow and lethal grace. She didn't just fight, she danced with death. She struck with precision and ancient power, moving too fast for Elias to track, weaving shadows into sharp weapons, turning the gloom itself against her attackers. Horror element, she was merciless, efficient, and utterly terrifying. One moment an Ignis Mortis agent was attacking. The next he was screaming as the shadows pulled the life and heat from his body, leaving a desiccated husk. But there were too many. Another pair of attackers arrived, flanking Lyra. As she engaged them, a third broke past her defenses and lunged for the sarcophagus. Elias saw the attacker's fiery blade arcing towards him. He ducked, scrambling backward, his heart pounding a desperate rhythm. He grabbed the only thing he could, a heavy brass urn used for storing ancient oils, and hurled it blindly. It hit the attacker, distracting him just long enough for Lyra to lash out with a whip of shadow, binding his legs. Lyra dispatched the last of the attackers, her breathing barely ragged. She looked down at the rapidly cooling bodies of the Ignis Mortis agents, her face etched with cold fury. "They breached the wards of silence," she murmured, scanning the environment. "That is only possible with a specific Ethel key, one known only to the highest court. This was an inside job." Elias, still shaking, pointed to the body of the one he'd hit with the urn. "Wait. Look at that." The Ignis Mortis agent was wearing a ring, a simple iron band on his right hand. Elias recognized the design instantly from his research. It was not a typical Ignis Mortis symbol. It was a secondary ancient marker used only by Umbra Ethel scribes and archivists, the lineage dedicated to preserving historical truth. Lyra followed his gaze, her eyes narrowing dangerously. "That mark," Elias whispered, piecing together the pattern. "It's the personal sigil of the scribe line. Only a few still wear it, the most senior." "Silas," Lyra finished, her voice a low, terrifying growl. The pieces clicked into place. The matching coordinates. The inner court key. The strange, subtle warnings Silas had given Elias. He hadn't just suspected Elias. He had been probing him, monitoring his knowledge, and positioning himself as a loyal watchman while actively working against Lyra. "He tried to cast doubt on you, Lyra," Elias said, his voice hard with the shock of betrayal. "He told me not to question the loyalty of your court. He was buying time." Lyra's face was a mask of devastation. Not fear but deep ancient pain. Silas had been with her for 1,500 years. He was the anchor of her court. "Find him," she commanded, her voice vibrating with cold rage. "Now." Lyra and Elias tracked Silas to a smaller and used wing of the manor, the former scribe's quarters. They found him kneeling before a large, intricate shadow-casting mirror, whispering into the glass. He was preparing to flee, attempting to open a hidden portal out of Ethelhold. Lyra didn't give him a chance to run. She moved with lethal speed, slamming him against the wall, her arm pressed against his throat. "Silas," Lyra snarled, the sound closer to a hiss than a voice. "Tell me why. After 15 centuries of loyalty, why did you open my gates to the Ignis Mortis?" Silas did not struggle. He looked up at his empress, his pale eyes finally showing emotion. Not guilt, but cold, fanatic conviction. Loyalty? Silas coughed, struggling for air. My loyalty is to the survival of the Ethel, Lyra, not to your sentimentality. You claim this human for love. For stability. You are blinded by the false promises of the heart-bound kin. First twist confirmed. Silas wasn't working for the Ignis Mortis to destroy the Ethel. He was working with a radical, internal faction who believed Lyra's methods were weak. He was attempting to force a regime change. The prophecy states the heart-bound is dangerous, Silas continued, his voice rising in desperation. The kin is a catalyst for power, not a consort for comfort. You are meant to use his essence to forge the shadow key, not to share your bed. The Ignis Mortis needs to be wiped out with absolute, devastating power, and you, Empress, are too soft. Lyra staggered back slightly, wounded by the revelation of his true motive. You would betray me, betray our pact because you fear hope? I fear your weakness, Silas spat. I gave them the keys so they could capture the human, force your hand, and end this war now before your fragile new love costs us everything. Elias stepped forward, his historian's anger overriding his fear. You plan to sacrifice thousands of lives just to prove a political point? Silas looked at Elias with utter contempt. Your life is irrelevant, human. You are merely a tool, a battery, and Lyra is too weak to realize it. Lyra looked at the face of her ancient friend, then at the terrified yet fiercely protective human standing beside her. The emotional trauma was evident, but her resolve hardened. The betrayal hurt her deeply, but Silas had forced her hand. You have chosen your side, scribe, Lyra said, her voice now cold and final. And you have chosen its consequence. Lyra did not hesitate. With a terrifying surge of shadow, she enveloped Silas. The horror was quick and absolute. A flash of light followed by a dry, snapping sound, and Silas crumpled to the floor, reduced to ash and bone. Elias stared, horrified at the efficiency of the execution. This was the horror of eternity. The loss of life meant nothing to those who never died. Lyra turned, the mask of the Empress back in place, but her hand trembled slightly as she took Elias's. Do not let them poison you, Elias. My intention for you is not merely to survive, but to truly live. The immediate cleanup after the ambush and Silas's execution was swift and chillingly efficient, managed by Lyra's remaining loyalists. For Elias, the event was a devastating reality check. He wasn't just researching history anymore, he was living through its most brutal, ancient power struggle. He found Lyra later that night in a private study, a small, warm room filled not with shadows, but with human-made artifacts, including a small antique music box. She was staring into a fireplace, the flames reflecting dimly in her obsidian eyes. She hadn't replenished her strength. She looked diminished, hollowed out by the necessity of her action. Elias walked to her, no longer guided by fear, but by a sudden, protective empathy. He didn't ask about Silas. The political betrayal was done. He asked about the 1500 years of friendship. It is the curse of eternity, Elias, Lyra whispered, her voice a low, painful rasp. You watch every connection you make wither and turn to dust. Human lives are too brief to bear the weight of time. And the immortal ones? They either fail you in battle or they fail you through ideology. She reached out and took his hand, her grip cold and trembling. Emotional romantic arc. This was not the Empress, but a woman crushed by 2 millennia of duty and loss. Silas saw me as a flawed relic, too weary to fight a decisive war, she confessed. He believed that by forcing the Ignis Mortis to take you, he would force me to use the ultimate power, the shadow key, to save myself regardless of the cost to you or the human world. He was desperate, blinded by fear, and fundamentally wrong about the nature of survival. But you didn't let him use me, Elias murmured, squeezing her hand, offering the simple warmth of his human touch. You killed your oldest friend to protect a mortal you barely know. Lyra turned her head, resting her cheek against their joined hands. I claimed you because the pact demanded it. I keep you because the thought of losing the only light I've felt in centuries is unacceptable. The prophecy needs a catalyst, Elias. But I need a consort. The admission was her closest equivalent to a declaration of love, a fusion of need, destiny, and genuine, frightening affection. That night, their shared intimacy was profound. It wasn't just passion, it was a desperate exchange of warmth and cold, fear and devotion, cementing the terrifying bond that transcended mere attraction. Elias had found his purpose, and Lyra had found her anchor. In the following weeks, Elias dedicated himself to Lyra's cause, determined to prove Silas wrong. He used his unique historian's eye to pore over the ancient texts detailing the Ignis Mortis. He wasn't just looking at battle strategies. He was looking for motivation for the fundamental schism that created this destructive faction. He discovered something that horrified him. The Ignis Mortis wasn't born of simple evil, it was born of a catastrophic failure. An ancient prophecy written in a language only Elias was fully translating, foretold the coming of the final eclipse, a time when the veil between worlds would thin, allowing the Umbra Ethel to fully claim dominion over the world, but only if they had the strength of the heart-bound kin to guide them. The Ignis Mortis believed that this final eclipse would not bring dominion, but destruction, a flood of cosmic horror that would wipe out both races. Their chaos wasn't random, it was a desperate, destructive attempt to break the prophecy, to prevent the eclipse by ensuring there was nothing left for the shadows to claim. They believed their destructive purpose was the true preservation of life. Elias showed Lyra the translation, his hands shaking. The Ignis Mortis isn't just a rogue faction. They're a counter-terrorist group in their own twisted way. They believe they're preventing a cataclysm that you are supposed to cause. Lyra read the text, her face impassive. This is old, Elias. Distorted. The Ignis Mortis are masters of self-justification. But what if it's true? Elias challenged, pointing to a cryptic passage. What if the heart-bound kin isn't meant to empower the Ethel, but to open the gate? This text implies that the kin is the final lock, and when claimed by an empress that lock is released. Lyra turned away, suddenly cold. You are dwelling on ancient fears, consort. Focus on the current war. But her reaction was too sharp, too defensive. Elias knew he had hit a nerve. His curiosity was piqued. He began to research Lyra's own lineage, seeking out the oldest, most guarded archives. Driven by the need to understand Lyra's true motives, and the fate of his own soul, Elias risked entering the deepest, most sealed wing of Ethelhold, a wing only Lyra was supposed to access. He used his knowledge of ancient wards and his innate stealth, honed by his training, to slip past the remaining guards. In the center of this wing he found not weapons or strategy, but a mausoleum, a gallery of stone sarcophagi dedicated to Lyra's direct ancestors. There were three, her mother, her father, and an older sibling or relative. Elias studied the inscription on the oldest sarcophagus, belonging to Lyra's ancestor, the first Empress of Shadows. The inscription was a long, flowery dedication to her strength and her ultimate sacrifice to save the Ethel from a great darkness. But Elias noticed a tiny, almost invisible detail. One of the symbols etched into the stone was wrong. It wasn't the Umbra Ethel symbol of balance. It was a fractured symbol, one that Elias had only seen in the most obscure, forbidden texts, a symbol for corrupting power. He looked at the second sarcophagus, that of her parent. The same fracture, more pronounced this time. Finally he stood before the third sarcophagus, the sibling. The inscription was nearly destroyed, but the symbol of corrupting power was carved deeply, repeatedly, almost in a frenzy. This was the final piece of the puzzle. The horror of the lineage. The Umbra Ethel weren't just guardians. They were a line perpetually struggling against an ancient corruption within their own blood, passed down through the centuries. The corruption was the core of the Ignis Mortis, a terrifying, aggressive, power-hungry instinct. Just as Elias realized the full extent of this dark heritage, a faint, cold whisper slithered into his mind, no longer coming from the shadows, but from the depths of the mausoleum. He is close now, sister. Your mortal toy has led him home. Elias froze, recognizing the voice. It was ancient, cruel, and deeply, intimately familiar to Lyra. The chilling whisper from the darkness was the single most terrifying thing Elias had heard in Ethelhold. It was ancient, cruel, and spoke with an authority that matched Lyra's own. He is close now, sister. Your mortal toy has led him home. Elias spun around, but the mausoleum was empty. The voice had come from everywhere and nowhere, a cold tendril of thought in his own mind. He recognized the meaning instantly. Lyra had a sibling or a close family member who was the true leader of the Ignis Mortis, and that person was now closing in on Ethelhold. Before he could process the full terror of this, Lyra's voice, sharp and furious, sliced through the air. Elias, how dare you breach the sealed wing? She emerged from the shadows, her face twisted with a mix of fury and fear. Her eyes fell immediately on the sarcophagi, then on the symbol of corrupting power on her sibling's tomb. She realized what he had seen. You weren't supposed to see this, she hissed, seizing his arm, pulling him out of the mausoleum with unnatural force. You were supposed to trust me. I did trust you. Until I found out your ancestors weren't just guardians, they were fighting a corruption in their own blood. Elias countered, pulling his arm free. That symbol on your sibling's tomb, it's the core of the Ignis Mortis. And that voice I just heard, your enemy, is your family, isn't it? Lyra froze, her breath hitching. The Empress's mask shattered, revealing raw, agonizing grief. Yes, she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. It is my brother Darian. And he is worse than anything you can imagine. Before she could explain, the entire manor shook violently. The sound wasn't the contained impact of the previous skirmish. It was the sound of Ethelhold's massive, millennia-old wards shattering. He's here, Lyra said, her eyes flashing with grim determination. He's not sending agents. He's here to finish us both. Lyra raced toward the central hall, pulling Elias in tow, issuing sharp commands to her remaining loyalists. The battle was already upon them. Ignis Mortis forces, hundreds of them, powered by chaotic energy, poured into the manor. They fought with a devastating, suicidal intensity, driven by the ultimate fanaticism of their leader. Lyra took her stand in the great hall, shadows coiling around her like lethal, living snakes. She was magnificent, a perfect weapon of defense, but she was outnumbered and distracted by the sheer emotional weight of the enemy's identity. Then the true enemy emerged. Darian descended from the shattered dome of the great hall, enveloped in a swirling vortex of orange-red flame and ash. He was strikingly similar to Lyra, the same regal height, the same ancient beauty, but twisted by malice. His eyes glowed with the inner heat of a dying star. Sister, Darian's voice was a triumphant roar, echoing with pain and madness. You cling to the vestiges of light and a mortal whim. When will you learn? We are better than balance. We are the purest form of power, the corruption. He landed, the heat of his presence pushing Lyra back. He saw Elias standing behind her, wide-eyed and terrified, and sneered. And you brought me the key, didn't you, little sister? The heart-bound kin. Darian extended a hand, and a tendril of dark, fire-laced smoke reached for Elias. He has the blood to open the gate, Lyra. The gate to the primordial chaos that will grant us dominion over everything. You try to suppress your nature. I embrace it. Lyra's claim on Elias was necessary not just to fight the war, but because his heart-bound blood was the one thing that could activate the ultimate power, a corrupted, devastating power that Darian wanted. Lyra was trying to protect Elias from that destiny, by claiming him first and suppressing the ritual. The final confrontation began. Lyra fought Darian with a savage fury that transcended martial skill. It was the fight of two siblings tearing each other apart. Shadows and fire clashed, shaking the ancient fortress to its foundations. I tried to save you, Darian. Lyra screamed, deflecting a blade of hardened fire. You tried to cage me. To deny the power of our father's true gift. Darian roared back. This mortal is not your consort, Lyra. He is the key. I will take his essence, and together we will unleash the final eclipse. Darian overwhelmed Lyra, his destructive fire magic proving superior to her defensive shadows. He slammed her against a pillar, leaving her momentarily stunned and weakened. He turned to Elias, his expression pure, triumphant hunger. Come, little kin. Let me show you the truth of eternity. Elias was trapped. Darian's presence was overwhelming, seductive, promising power and purpose far greater than Lyra ever had. But Elias had seen Lyra's weakness, her grief, and her desperate need for connection. He had chosen his eternity. He knew the prophecy. The kin's power was activated by absolute claim and consent. I won't join you, Darian, Elias shouted, finding a core of human courage he didn't know he possessed. My claim is already settled. And my blood will never serve your madness. He made a sudden, desperate movement. He didn't attack Darian. He ran toward Lyra. Ignoring Darian's roar of rage, Elias knelt beside Lyra, who was struggling to rise, and without hesitation, he leaned down and kissed her. It was a kiss of utter devotion and conscious choice. And as their lips met, the blood oath he had made, the reckless, silly gesture with a drop of blood, exploded with power. Elias's human heart pounded, and the unique resonance in his blood surged, not as a weapon but as a binding force. Lyra felt the surge, a profound, non-corruptible infusion of stability and strength. The dark corruption that had weakened her lineage for millennia recoiled. Her eyes flared, no longer just golden, but radiating pure, concentrated shadow power. Thank you, consort, she whispered, her strength restored, her purpose crystallized. She rose, towering over Darian, the true empress of shadows, now unbound and fully claimed. Lyra stood between Elias and her corrupted brother, the surge of power from the heartbound kin's bond radiating from her. Her shadows were no longer just defense. They were instruments of divine power, woven with the stabilizing essence of Elias's human soul. You failed, Darian. Lyra's voice was calm, utterly cold and powerful. The kin has made his choice. My line is purified. Darian howled, a sound of agony and fury. Purity is weakness. I am the true destiny of the Ethel. He launched his final devastating attack, a concentrated blast of chaotic, scorching fire that consumed the very air. Lyra met it not with a shield but with a vortex. She spun her hands, and the shadows around her twisted into a miniature black hole, an absolute void that swallowed Darian's flame whole, instantly extinguishing its heat and light. The climax, Lyra fought with newfound control, leveraging the unique bond with Elias. She didn't just fend off Darian's attacks, she used her shadows to neutralize his chaotic power, draining the fire madness from his form. Elias, despite his exhaustion, used his knowledge. He remembered the prophecy. The kin's resonance could be used to seal, not just open, the gates of power. He focused on the center of the great hall, where the battle raged, and poured his energy, the quiet, resonant strength of his human soul, into the ancient seals carved into the floor. As Lyra physically restrained Darian, pinning him against the floor with crushing shadow tendrils, Elias finished his ritual. The seals on the floor of the great hall flared, pulsing with a stabilizing, non-corruptible light that clashed violently with Darian's chaos. The light didn't kill Darian, it began to seal him. No, sister, don't. The eclipse will come without me. You need my power. Darian screamed, his voice turning desperate, the madness receding slightly to reveal pure terror. The eclipse comes, brother, Lyra said, standing over him, her face a mixture of triumph and immense, final sorrow. But now I have the strength to manage it. You, however, will wait for the next millennium. With one final, wrenching surge of power, Lyra completed the sealing. Darian was enveloped in solid, light-absorbing shadow, which then condensed, hardening into an obsidian sarcophagus identical to those in the mausoleum, instantly merging with the stone of the great hall floor. He was imprisoned, sealed not by death, but by the purified power of his sister and the stabilizing resonance of the heartbound kin. The battle was over. The Ignis Mortis forces, deprived of their leader's chaotic energy, wavered, then collapsed, their forms dissipating into harmless ash. Lyra stood in the wrecked hall, breathing deeply. The intense gold light faded from her eyes, leaving only the profound darkness of exhaustion. She had won, but at the cost of her deepest connection and the slaughter of her own family. Elias, utterly spent, stumbled to her side. The adrenaline was gone, replaced by bone-deep weariness and the dizzying knowledge of what he had just done. He was trembling. Lyra didn't speak. She simply pulled him into her arms, holding him with a fierce, possessive strength that felt like the end of a very long journey. You saved me, Elias, she whispered into his hair, the coldness of her skin a soothing contrast to the residual heat of the battle. Not just Ethelhold, not just our race. You saved me from my own lineage, from the constant pull of the corruption. You're my anchor. My truest claim. You made your choice too, Elias murmured, clinging to her. You chose to protect me over seizing absolute power. Lyra pulled back, a genuine, soft smile finally gracing her lips, a smile Elias had never seen before. Absolute power is fleeting. You, my consort, are my eternity. In the weeks that followed, Ethelhold slowly rebuilt. Elias was no longer the frightened historian or the guarded asset. He was the acknowledged consort, a pivotal figure. Lyra openly relied on his advice, valuing his human perspective and his uncanny knowledge of ancient rituals. The remaining Ethel nobles, who had witnessed the power of the heartbound bond, bowed to him with deep respect. Elias was given the key to his gilded cage. He could leave if he wished. Lyra gave him the choice to return to his old life, to his dusty archives and his mundane routine. Elias looked at the key, then at the vast, shadowed world he now understood, and finally at Lyra, who watched him with calm, patient expectation. My old life, Elias said, letting the key drop onto a velvet cushion. That was the joke. This is the truth. He walked to Lyra, taking her hand. The new eternity, my wish was for a connection that truly claims me, Lyra. And you are that claim. But on one condition. My purpose is not just to stabilize you. It is to remind you that even in eternity, there must be light. Lyra's obsidian eyes glowed with satisfaction. Agreed, consort. We will rule together. Balance and light. Shadow and man. 6 months later, Ethelhold was restored, stronger than ever. The great hall had been refitted, the seals reinforced. Elias had integrated completely, not as a vampire, but as the only human who stood as an equal to the Empress of Shadows. He had found his life worth living, filled with purpose, danger, and a terrifying, absolute love. He sat on a balcony high above the dark forest, working on a new history, the true history of the Ethel and the Ignis Mortis, a history he could now write with full knowledge. Lyra emerged from the shadows, wearing a simple, elegant black gown. She moved to the edge of the balcony, gazing out at the rising sun, a sight that was still painful to her ancient eyes, but one she endured for him. The border tensions are calming, she said softly. The Ignis Mortis remnants are disorganized, leaderless. The war is ending, Elias. Because of you. Elias rose, wrapping his arms around her from behind. He felt the familiar coldness of her skin, the ancient power humming beneath the silk, but he no longer feared it. He loved it. We have eternity, Lyra, he whispered, resting his chin on her shoulder. But eternity is long. Are there other challenges? Other threats? Lyra leaned back against him, closing her eyes, savoring the warmth of his embrace. Always, my consort. There are always other shadows. Other worlds. And always other madmen who believe they know better than the Empress and her king. She turned in his arms, her eyes meeting his. She smiled, a profound, intimate gesture that erased 2,000 years of solitude. But the greatest secret, Elias, is this, she murmured, her voice filled with dark affection. When the Empress of Shadows finally finds her light, she becomes the most possessive creature in all the cosmos. She lowered her head and sealed the promise with a cold, passionate kiss. Their eternity had only just begun. Elias spent the immediate months after Darien sealing not in celebration, but in study and quiet, anxious reflection. Though he was the consort, the hero who anchored the Empress, the gruesome efficiency of Silas's execution still haunted his mind. Lyra had reduced a 15-century-old servant to ash in a second, necessary or not. The sheer, overwhelming power, and the casual dismissal of life that came with eternity, was the horror he had to reconcile. He confronted Lyra about it one evening in the newly rebuilt war room. The large, circular chamber was now less about tracking enemy movements and more about managing stability. Do you ever regret Silas? Elias asked, the question hanging heavy in the cool air. Lyra, who was tracing a new protective ward on the central map table, paused. She didn't look up immediately. I regret the necessity of his demise, Elias. I regret the corruption of his mind. But I do not regret the action. He was a poison. She finally met his eyes, which held a profound, terrifying honesty. You are still counting years, my consort. Silas's betrayal, if successful, would have ended millennia of fragile peace. It would have cost millions of human lives and extinguished the Ethel. His life was a flicker against the coming darkness. I had to choose the survival of the many over the sadness of the one. That is the burden of the crown. She walked to him, taking his hands and tracing the lines of his knuckles. Emotional depth, your love, your empathy, that is why you are my anchor. You hold on to the value of a single human life. Do not lose that, Elias. But you must understand that eternity sometimes demands cruel mathematics. I need you to challenge me, yes. But I also need you to accept my nature. The shadows are long and they require a strong hand. This honesty, brutal as it was, settled the horror in Elias. He realized his life with Lyra would always be a balancing act. His human heart against her ancient necessity. He wasn't there to soften her entirely, but to ensure her power was guided by his unique compassion. He had found not just love, but a terrifying, absolute responsibility. Elias formally closed the door on his old life. Lyra had sent a disguised Ethel agent to clean out his small apartment. All his books, his files, his few mundane possessions, all were brought to Ethelhold. He spent weeks organizing his belongings in a vast, cold library wing. Among the dusty boxes, he found his old utility knife, the one that had cut his thumb, the blood-stained copy of the Ethel marriage rite. Holding the physical proof of his reckless wish, he smiled, a genuine, content smile for the first time since his abduction. Lyra found him there, sitting on the floor surrounded by his research. You brought all of this? She asked, gesturing to the stacks of human history. This is my armor, Lyra, Elias said, tapping a stack of old folklore texts. The Ignis Mortis survived because their madness was rooted in a sliver of truth, a corrupted prophecy. My job now is to understand how human history, how myth, interacts with your reality. To prevent the next Darien from emerging, we need to know what stories they are telling themselves. Elias's role solidified. He wasn't just a consort. He was the archivist of the claimed, integrating human knowledge into Ethel strategy. He used the immense resources of Ethelhold to digitize and cross-reference his findings, becoming a vital intelligence asset. He was the human who made the shadow smart. Lyra watched him, her expression softening with pride. You found your purpose, Elias. You found a life worth living. We found it, he corrected, standing up and pulling her into a slow, profound embrace. You may be the Empress of Shadows, but you are also a civilization of secrets. And I am the only man who gets to read your pages. Their intimacy was now rooted in this shared purpose and deep, mutual respect. The human mind and the immortal power working in tandem. As the immediate threats receded, the focus shifted to the future. Elias was still mortal. The reality of their differing lifespans was a silent, looming fear. Lyra, sensing this anxiety, addressed it directly. One night, sitting together beneath the restored, glowing dome of the Great Hall, she spoke of the final, unspoken question. I will never demand you change, Elias, she said, resting her head on his shoulder. I claimed your human soul, and that is what I treasure. But the blood oath is a profound thing. It is not merely symbolic. She explained the deep, final layer of the prophecy. The heart-bound kin's soul, once fully claimed and stabilized, creates a bridge. Elias could choose to remain mortal, living out his natural span with Lyra, a heartbreaking thought for both, or he could choose a different path. The resonance in your blood, the stability you brought, has anchored me. If you choose it, I can use that bond to grant you the long sleep, a suspended state of near immortality. You would not become Ethel, you would not become a creature of shadow, but you would be preserved, eternally connected to me, waking only when I need you or when a new crisis demands your unique perspective. The choice was terrifying. It meant losing his connection to the mundane world forever, but gaining true eternity by Lyra's side. It wasn't turning into a monster, it was choosing a different kind of life, a life bound utterly and irrevocably to her. Elias thought of the dust of his old life, the terror of the war, the majesty of Ethelhold, and the absolute consuming love he felt for the Empress who had claimed him. He looked up at Lyra, her face etched with ancient hope. I wished for eternity that means something, Elias said, his voice firm. An eternity without you would be a return to the void. I choose the long sleep. I choose our eternity. Lyra smiled, a radiant, triumphant sight. Then rest, my consort, and dream of the wars we will win together. She kissed him, a deep, passionate claiming that sealed his choice, and then, slowly, used her shadowed power to weave a cocoon of pure, stabilizing energy around him. Elias felt his human consciousness gently